Consulting Group. I'm very proud to bring you this important topic today that some of you have not really thought about in the past, but others have actually come across because you may have negotiated a lease agreement recently, or perhaps you're looking to enter into negotiations on a lease agreement with your landlord. And I do want to thank our partner, Henry Schein Animal Health, for really allowing this topic to be brought forward to your attention. And they've been extremely supportive of raising awareness and helping us protect the tenant rights of veterinarians and animal health practitioners. Before I dive into the rest of the presentation, I want to take care of some housekeeping items. For those of you that are just joining us, we have more than 150 animal health practitioners on this webinar today, and due to the volume of attendees, we're not going to be taking questions right off the bat. We're going to leave those questions for the end of the webinar. So if you have questions, there will be an opportunity at the end of this webinar for you to ask those questions through the online chat window. And if you prefer to submit those questions by email, you're also more than welcome to do so. My email address is on the screen before you. And if we do not get to all of the questions today, I'd be more than happy to address those questions in a private response to any of the attendees that are attending today. With respect to the webinar itself, I know that some of you are very keen on learning about this topic of how to negotiate an office lease agreement for your hospital, and this webinar is being recorded so that it is available for your future viewing. As many of you have in the past that have attended our webinar series on the topic of lease negotiations have requested that this information be shared with you again, or perhaps be shared with your colleagues who do not have the benefit of being here with us today. We have a very packed agenda for the next 60 minutes. I will start off giving you some background on who we are as an organization and why we're talking about this important topic. We're going to discuss some alarming industry trends, and by industry trends I'm referring to trends as it relates to healthcare real estate and how animal health practitioners negotiate lease agreements. Why is the lease so important? I don't think that it would be doing you justice if we did not talk about the aspects of the lease that are beneficial and those that are detrimental to the value of your business. And we're going to spend some time also discussing the $100,000 traps in your lease agreement, talking about specific provisions that either increase or decrease your liability depending on how they are structured.
Participant has left the conference.
Landing floors out.
We also want to talk about the key leasing considerations when starting, buying, or selling a practice, in addition to discussing what we call the tenant lease cycle. This is essentially a diagram that illustrates the importance of timing your negotiation for those of you that are in an existing lease agreement, and the role that time plays in providing you with leverage when you are negotiating your lease. We're also going to discuss the 7-step process that we follow internally at Cirrus Consulting Group when we negotiate a lease agreement on behalf of our clients. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be about 5 to 10 minutes of time at the end of today's presentation where each of you will have the opportunity to address and bring forward any concerns you have as it relates to the lease agreement for your office, or perhaps you're a young associate looking to start or purchase a clinic. Over 75% of veterinarians have signed an agreement that can prevent them from transferring their lease and ever selling their practice due to landlord interference. So 3 out of 4 dentists today have a lease agreement that may prevent them from being able to sell their practice. And this is something that to us is very alarming. The animal health practitioner practitioners engage in lease renewal negotiations without understanding complex lease provisions do end up paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in unnecessary expenses as far as rent increases over the next 5 to 10 or even some cases 20 years. Healthcare practitioners, in our opinion, are the least risky type of commercial tenant that a landlord can have. And what's interesting is that a lot of landlords do like to have an animal hospital, or for that matter, if we're looking at the broader healthcare industry, physicians and dentists as tenants. And why is that? It's because as veterinarians, you have some of the lowest default rates as it relates to defaulting on lease agreements, but more importantly, defaulting as far as on practice loan. And the bankruptcy rate with respect to your colleagues is low in comparison to other industries. And by other industries, I'm referring specifically to retail tenants. How often is it that, come around December time, if a retailer isn't able to get back into the black and really have a great quarter, they're then forced to essentially shut down the store. How many signs do you see in your own city where a retailer that's been there for several years has not been able to make it? So from that perspective, we do believe that healthcare tenants have some of the strongest financial positions, and as such, they are very desirable to a landlord. And they also increase the value of the property that a landlord has, primarily because you and your colleagues enter into long-term lease agreements. To provide you with some context as to why we're putting on this educational webinar and to look at things through our lens, I want to spend some time discussing who Cirrus is and how we came about negotiating lease agreements for your colleagues. We were founded by healthcare professionals in 1994, and we analyze thousands of office leases each year. Luckily, with the advances in technology, we've been able to digitize a lot of these lease agreements. But back in the 1990s, we would have massive rooms of lease agreements because somewhere across the country, doctors would send in their lease agreement, have us review it, and have us negotiate it. And because we have the privilege of accessing this information and really understanding how you and your colleagues negotiate lease agreements, but more importantly, how you practice, has given us a lot of insight with respect to how we can ensure that the outcome of the lease negotiation is beneficial for you and the value of your business. We also have represented over 1,000 practitioners last year alone. These are a combination of existing tenants. These are doctors that are leasing space, in addition to what we call owner-occupiers. Some of your colleagues, or maybe perhaps you yourself attending today's webinar, are in a situation where you own both the animal hospital as well as the property where it's located. And from that perspective, it is important to have a lease agreement in place between your hospital and ideally a corporation you set up to manage the property such that there's a separation of the assets, number one, and number two, you really derive the benefits from a tax and insurance standpoint of having what we call an arm's length lease in place. We have negotiated over 12,000 office leases over the past 2 decades. And we also conduct over 150 educational in-person seminars annually and participate in various industry-related events and conferences. Most recently, I had the privilege of participating in the AVMA convention and had the opportunity to meet a lot of great veterinarians who are really focusing on growing their practice, and some of them are actually looking at expanding. And it's really great to see that health in the industry. And we come into the picture when a doctor is looking at their real estate plan, is thinking about how do I ensure that my real estate strategy is aligned with the strategy I have for growing my patient roster. And today we're proud to be a premier healthcare tenant representation firm as a result of the work that we've done over the last 21 years for veterinarians in North America. some of our recent clients, you may recognize some of these names. We, because we're a North American-wide firm, we do negotiate lease agreements and also that are late joiners. As I mentioned in my introduction, if you do have questions, we are going to leave some time in the end of the webinar for you to be able to post those questions through the online chat window, which you'll have access to in the last 10 minutes of today's program. And these doctors that you see on your screen, these are a combination of practitioners who are either starting practices, those looking to expand their office, relocate, associates looking to buy into practices, in addition to doctors looking to sell and transition. And regardless of where your colleagues are and where you are in your career, the lease agreement plays a fundamental role in ensuring that you have some security and predictability as to whether or not you will be able to execute on your vision. Now, before diving into some of the technical terms within an office lease, because I know many of you are attending today's presentation and some of you have a copy of your lease agreement in front of you and are looking to make notes. Before I discuss the terminology commonly found in your lease agreement, I want to spend a little bit of time asking you this question and think about your own practice in your clinic. You know, what is a lease agreement? When somebody mentions the word lease, what do you think about? Is it a check that you write to the landlord every month? The way we look at the lease agreement is that it is a check. In fact, it is one of the biggest checks you will ever write. The reason I say that is because if you add up all the rent that you pay to your landlord over the duration of your career, for most of you, that's well over $1 million in expenses. And as far as the overhead expense in your office, can do to manage this expense goes a long way towards improving the bottom line for your practice. Now, unlike a check, a lease agreement comes with dozens upon dozens of legally binding provisions that affect your liability as an owner. And it's important not to look at the lease from the lens of just paying rent, but also consider the exposure you have by signing a lease agreement with your landlord that obligates you to perform certain covenants or agree to certain things throughout the life cycle of your tenancy. So for example, if the roof needs repair, who pays for that? If the HVAC breaks down and it's a $25,000 plus expense, is that your responsibility or the landlord's responsibility? Is it a plain expense? Is this something you foresaw coming? And too many doctors call us every single day asking questions as to whether or not they're liable for certain expenses or for something that has occurred with the property, if there's been damage done to the property. Now, why is the lease agreement so important? First and foremost, we know from our experience having represented veterinarians for the last 21 years that it's very expensive to get into the business. When you set up your hospital for the first time, there's a significant investment you made, not only in equipment, but the leasehold improvements within the premises. And most of you have spent over $100 per square foot building out your practice. And the lease agreement really is the foundation for the practice. The reason being is because if today you're not the owner of your building, the only thing that secures your goodwill and allows you to produce income is the stability you have in giving your clients the ability to come and essentially have you service and look after them and look after the patients. And so from that perspective, it's critical to realize that the lease is the glue that holds your equipment and your goodwill together. We know from our experience, having dealt with dozens upon dozens of relocations, that it's very difficult to move. If you have an animal hospital and you were forced to move that 3 miles away, what happens to your patient base? Does it diminish? Do you have the ability to have the same access to that building? You know, if you're in a building where you have the benefit of having plenty of room and having the right configuration to allow you to maximize productivity, what if there wasn't a space available that was comparable to what you have, and you ended up moving to a location that was perhaps harder to work out of? What does that do to your productivity and your personal fulfillment? It's also very time-consuming to move, as I mentioned, because typically the timeline it takes to move a clinic is anywhere between 9 to 12 months, in many cases more, depending on where you are in the country. Yesterday I was talking to a doctor who is practicing in Indianapolis, and we were looking at properties where she could move into. And it became very apparent where she was that it was going to be very difficult and time-consuming to get a permit. Number two, the spaces that were available were not all ideal for her clinic. And we had to go through a process of site selection and determine, what makes sense. And so that whole research process in of itself can take several weeks in the beginning without even us contacting a landlord and discussing the lease terms. So if you're thinking about relocating, realize it's very time-consuming to relocate and move, and this is why we'd much rather prefer you have a lease agreement that secures your long-term future in your existing location. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be patient attrition. If you do end up moving your hospital, there'll definitely be some attrition depending on how far away you're forced to relocate. Now, we've talked about some of the aspects of why the lease is important, and what is the benefit of having a properly negotiated lease? First and foremost, we believe that a properly negotiated lease agreement should provide you with fair and affordable financial terms. For those of you that are in an existing lease or about to sign a lease agreement, are you signing a gross lease or a triple net lease? Are there different types of lease agreements? There absolutely are. And knowing what type of lease you're signing makes all the difference, because if you're the doctor in Minnesota who I spoke with this morning who's about to enter into a lease agreement, and you really like the rental rate of $16 per square foot, but you have not factored in the uncapped common area maintenance expense that can increase at any percentage year over year, are you really getting a fair deal from the landlord? Or are you putting yourself in a situation where, because the base rental rate on that lease agreement looks attractive, you're going to go ahead and sign it without really realizing that the landlord can increase their operating costs over time and charge you a proportionate share of that? And fair and affordable financial terms really comes down to making sure that the rental rate you're being offered or are paying today is in line with what's going on in the market. The lease should also provide you with long-term stability and security. What do I mean by that? The average term that we recommend to our clients is a 10-year term with 2 or 3 options to renew the lease agreement for a period of 5 years. The reason why we recommend a 10-year term, aside from the benefit you have as far as being able to obtain financing for your build-out, not to mention the amortization, the benefit of having a long-term lease really stems from knowing that once you've made the significant investment in a location, most of you do not ever want to leave that location. And by signing a long-term lease agreement, it allows you to have that stability. By security, I'm referring to primarily the notion that you have the ability to continue practicing in the location without having any interference by the landlord or any disruption to your services. The lease should also minimize your risk and exposure. How many of you that have signed lease agreements have signed those lease agreements in your personal names? Too many of your colleagues across North America sign lease agreements that are in their personal names. In fact, out of every 10 lease agreements that I personally review for veterinarians, I would say 8 out of 10 of those lease agreements are signed under the doctor's name or are signed under the corporation, but the doctor has agreed to being a personal guarantor or indemnifier. And that's something that has to be addressed. You don't want to have personal liability on a lease agreement. The lease should also maximize your flexibility as an owner. And if part of your transition plan is to add an associate or two, or perhaps you're looking to have the flexibility to sublease some space that you're not utilizing, is that factored into the contract you have with your landlord? And do you have the flexibility to grow in their current location? If the tenant next door moved out and you needed that space for an expansion project, will the landlord give you that flexibility? And last but not least, the lease agreement should enhance your ability to eventually sell your practice. Now we're going to get into some of the technical provisions in the lease agreement. And if you have a copy of your lease in front of you, great. You can go and look through the table of contents to identify the provisions I'm about to discuss. For those of you that do not have a copy of your lease agreement, assuming you are in a lease agreement, if you don't have a copy of it in front of you, jot down a few notes about these provisions and really have us analyze those for you to ensure that they're properly interpreted and the risk with respect to these terms is properly identified. The first provision I'd like to discuss is one of the most common provisions that we find in the lease agreement. And that provision is called the option to renew. And the option to renew is the right of the tenant to extend the term of their lease agreement by a set period of time. And that provision is found in 90% of lease agreements that we review. The example before you, the paragraph you see, was taken directly from one of our clients' lease agreements, but for the purposes of confidentiality, we've removed the name of the tenant with that of Dr. Joe Black. And there are a number of concerns with this provision that when we first read this lease agreement, we identified and negotiated with the landlord. The first thing that we noticed was that the option to renew the lease agreement was personal to Dr. Joe Black, because in the event Dr. Black decided to sell his hospital, the purchaser would not have the benefit of exercising the option to renew. And that certainly would pose challenges with respect to whether or not the buyer of the hospital would offer the asking price, knowing that there's a possibility they may not be able to renew the lease agreement beyond its current expiration. Furthermore, many of the options to renew you have signed indicate that if you've ever been in default of the lease agreement, you lose the option to renew the lease. And to talk about default, the question is, what is considered a default? Is it non-payment or rent? The majority of the cases of default that we deal with and identify have nothing to do with the rental rates. They have more to do with the other provisions in the lease agreement that, for example, state if you're in a property and you decided to shut down the office for 2 weeks because you went on vacation, that's a breach of the continuous operation provision in the lease agreement. The landlord expects you to have somebody in the office at all times. Now, many of you are not aware of this. Some of this finer point is written into your lease agreement, but if you don't pay attention to it, the landlord could hold you in default, and in many cases, they're not even required to send you a notification that you're on default. They'll just bring it up when your lease comes up for renewal and utilize that as leverage to get what they want, which is higher rent. The other problem we identified with this option to renew example is that any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. And what this means is that if you hire the world's greatest lease negotiator and they're able to negotiate a phenomenal lease for you, when you renew the lease agreement, all of that dissipates. The landlord has the ability to present to you when you renew your lease agreement a lease that you've never seen before. And we know that most landlords update their lease agreements. And when they update their lease agreements, they don't make it more tenant-friendly. They specifically update their lease agreements to ensure that they, as landlords, have more flexibility, that the lease is more one-sided to their favor. And so be careful if you're about to renew your lease agreement and ensuring that the landlord does not have the ability to present a lease you've never seen before. The other with the option to renew exam for you is that it does explicitly state that the rental rate for the time period in which the lease is extended will event be less than the rent paid during the last year of the original term. And if you've signed a lease with this language in it, congratulations, because you've now just guaranteed that the landlord is going to be able to collect more rent from you. And that's something that we don't like to see because most of our clients don't like to pay more rent. I'm being a little bit sarcastic with respect to the comment congratulating you, but just realize that a lot of times you get into this situation not knowing how your lease is set up. So an option to renew typically is a trap if you have it in the lease agreement, unless it was explicitly negotiated the landlord and restructured for your benefit. And you simply don't want to be having a rental rate when you renew your lease agreement based on a market rent for renewing tenants in a building, because if that's the case and there happens to be a AAA tenant in your property who can afford to pay 20% more rent than you, when the landlord comes to you and renews your lease agreement, they're going to base that rental rate you're going to pay on the last renewal. And if that means it's going to go up by 20%, what does that do to your ability to sustain the practice long term? The second provision I'd like to discuss, and there's many of them in the lease agreement, we simply don't have time to go through all of them, but I want to focus on the provisions that affect your liability the most. And the second provision I'd like to discuss is called assignment. What is assignment? Assignment sometimes in the lease agreement is also considered transfer. It's sometimes labeled as transfer. You may see a heading in your lease agreement called assignment and subletting. Essentially what this provision means is that it's giving you as the tenant the right to transfer your lease agreement to a third party. In your case, it's usually the buyer of your clinic. And the landlord in the assignment provision, which is found in our experience in 75% of lease agreements, dictates what happens when you decide to assign the lease. And it goes without saying that when you want to transfer the lease agreement, you need the landlord's consent. And by consent, I mean the permission to transfer that lease agreement. And if you're like the doctor who we worked with a few years ago who was ready to retire and gone through the trouble of finding an ideal purchaser for your business, and you go through the liberty of presenting that buyer to the landlord to become their prospective tenant, the last thing you'd want is to face a situation where, like our doctor did, where the landlord is asking for either a percentage of the proceeds of the sale because they owned the leasehold improvements and in fact they contributed towards the cost of the build-out of our clinic, or B, they turn around and they say, we're happy to accept the buyer of the clinic as our tenant so long as this purchaser pays us more rent to justify that fact that we're accepting higher risk for accepting this young individual who's never owned a clinic or ran a clinic before. So with respect to consent, it is important to recognize that the landlord has certain rights to determine how the lease is transferred and under what circumstance that lease is transferable. And many lease agreements that we review for doctors do state, to their shock, that the landlord, upon receiving notification of their interest in transferring the lease agreement, has the option to terminate the lease agreement or to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then current market rent for the premises, or in this particular case, 15% greater than the current rental rate. Why would a landlord want to terminate your lease agreement if you decided to transfer it? The reason it being is because when you decide to transition, the landlord sees it as a great opportunity to adjust the rental rate, knowing that what you care about is retiring and what the buyer cares about is securing the practice at the most affordable price. And if they approach the buyer of your clinic and they said to them that they would entertain a brand new 10-year term, the buyer may be still interested, but they're certainly going to turn around and offer you less for the practice because depending on how the negotiations go, they may proceed with the purchase or alternatively, they may decide to walk away altogether because the landlord is being unreasonable with respect to the asking rent. The majority of the leases that we review also state that in no event shall the tenant be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant within the lease agreement. And what this simply means is that if you transfer a lease agreement, you as the then tenant still have liability well after you have sold your business. And this continuous liability is something that is 100% negotiable with the landlord and should be negotiated well ahead of a practice sale. There are other traps within the office lease agreement. We do hope that over the next 12 months, we'll be able to deliver more webinars to you discussing some of these other provisions in the lease agreement. And if you've had a lawyer review your lease agreement, how many of these provisions were brought to your attention? Aside from looking at the common area maintenance expenses or the rental rate. And unfortunately, because your business is unique, many lawyers do not understand the implications of, for example, having a relocation provision in your lease agreement, or say having a situation where if the building was sold, the buyer can turn around and decide what they want to do with the building, including having the building demolished, thereby terminating your tenancy. So these are important provisions to identify. If they've not been identified by your lawyer, I would highly recommend that you seek counsel and obtain the proper advice you need to identify them within your own agreement. The key components to starting a practice. Many of you who are attending today's webinar are doctors looking to start a practice from scratch. And I want to discuss 4 key categories of concessions that matter most to doctors looking at starting a clinic. The first one is rent. When you start a clinic, clearly you want to make sure that you obtain the most affordable rental rates. Now, don't forget that part of the notion of getting rent from the landlord that's fair has to also do with, is the landlord going to contribute towards the cost of my build-out, and is that a fair contribution based on what other tenants are providing and being given, what other landlords are giving tenants in the area. The third item is the fixturing period, and by fixturing period I mean the amount of time you have to improve the space and to install your trade fixtures. And too many of your colleagues who are associates looking at negotiating a lease for the first time sign offers that provide very limited fixturing periods. So the longer the fixturing period, the better, because during the fixturing period, you're not paying any base rent, and anything you can do to defer the payment of rent goes a long way to ensuring that your practice can break even. The fourth item within the lease agreement or category of concessions are the legal terms. And these legal terms do matter when you're starting a practice, because if they're not properly addressed, and say the building is sold, or alternatively, the landlord decides to add to the tenancy mix in the building and requires to take back 400, 500, or 600 square feet from you to accommodate an incoming tenant, that can be problematic. And despite the fact that you've spent a lot of money building your hospital, you may be in an unfortunate situation where you have to relinquish certain space because it was not properly addressed within the lease agreement. Now, there are also doctors that are attending today's webinar who are very keen on determining how they should address the aspect of negotiating lease agreement when they're buying or selling a practice. And for you, there are really 5 key categories of concessions that you have to negotiate. First is lots of term. And by lots of term, ideally, I mean you're either inheriting 10 years of term, if you're looking at buying an existing hospital, or alternatively, you're looking at selling your practice, you want to make sure that you're giving the buyer sufficient term because they're going to need to typically obtain financing from a bank, and that financing vehicle, which is a loan, will have to be amortized over the lease term. And if your lease term is short, it does present challenges for the buyer. The second category of concessions has to do with options to renew. Options to renew are beneficial. Why? Because they allow you to extend your tenancy. If you're looking at buying an existing clinic, make sure that there are options to renew, because you don't want to be in a situation where if the current lease agreement expires in 7 years, you're going to have to fork out the money to relocate and maybe in many cases relocate outside of the building. The third category of concessions has to do with personal guarantees. And by personal guarantees, and as I alluded to earlier, has to do with liability, personal liability. And if the landlord is asking you to sign a lease agreement when you're looking at buying a practice, an existing veterinary hospital, then you have to really make sure that that guarantee is not unconditional and is not unlimited. And there's ways of capping or reducing or eliminating the personal guarantee, which go a long way towards ensuring that both you and your family are not risking your personal assets in the event of a loss where the landlord is seeking damages. The fourth category of concessions has to do with the assignment of the lease agreement. If you're buying an existing business and the lease agreement for that clinic is being transferred to you, it is important to recognize as to whether or not the landlord has the ability to revise the rental rate. Because if they have the ability to revise the rental rate, what are you buying? Are you buying an asset that's going to become very quickly too expensive to operate? And for those of you looking to sell your office, it's critical that the landlord allows you to be relieved of liability after this is transferred. If you end up selling to, and this, by the way, was a concern with a doctor I spoke with on Tuesday, whereby he has found a buyer, but his concern, given the inexperience of the buyer, is that this individual may not be able to do what he did with the hospital. And what he did with the hospital was he took it from a production of $600,000 to $1.2 million. And his rental rate does reflect that, by the way. Now, that's certainly a concern that a lot of doctors have, and so being able to be relieved of liability really is critical to giving you peace of mind during retirement. The fifth category of concessions has to do with what I call early termination rights. And there are two instances where you need to terminate the lease early. The first one is an event of death. So God forbid, if you were to pass away, does your estate or your spouse have the right to terminate the lease agreement? The majority of the leases we review have zero termination right for the benefit of the tenant relating to death. In the event of death, what occurs is the liability to pay the rent automatically gets transferred to the estate, and your family then is liable for the payment of that rent in the event that there are personal guarantees and there are heirs to your estate. The other notion of early termination has to do with disability. If something happened to you and you could not continue running the clinic, what would occur? Well, the landlord still wants to collect rent, and you're forced to be in a situation where you may not necessarily be able to find another doctor to run the practice for you. And this relates to both short-term disability and also long-term disability. And again, the majority of the leases that your colleagues sign do not provide them with the ability to terminate the lease when they are disabled. Now, how do landlords negotiate lease agreements, and how can tenants better educate themselves with respect to the strategy the landlord uses to maximize their leverage? The diagram you see before you is what we refer to as the tenant lease cycle. This is essentially a tool that the landlord uses to determine when to negotiate a lease. And The gray area, the 24-month mark prior to the expiration date, is the window of time you have to negotiate a lease agreement. The closer you get to the expiration date, as the reddening of this donut shows, the harder it becomes to, number one, negotiate a lease agreement, and number two, reduce your rent. So if you're thinking about negotiating your lease agreement, really consider starting the process ideally 24 months prior to the expiration date if you're in an existing lease, to give yourself maximum time to negotiate the complicated provisions I discussed. And what steps should you follow when it comes to negotiating your lease agreement? What we do for existing tenants is we gather their documentation. This typically includes making sure that the lease documents they have are executed documents. Too many doctors have lease agreements that are not countersigned by the landlord. And if you have a contract that is not countersigned by the other party, is it legally enforceable? The answer is no. So we make sure that we gather the right documentation. We then review the lease agreement, and this is identified by the yellow portion of the process wheel, and identify all the provisions that I discussed. We also then look at the market rental rates. We look at the rental rates, we look at the vacancy rates in the area. We then discuss with the doctor, and this is something you can do yourself as well, talk about your outcome. What is the ideal outcome you want to achieve, and how do you plan on getting there? Now, as you probably have noticed, during the first 5 stages of our process wheel, we have not even picked up the phone or sent an email to our landlord. We find that too many doctors get into a situation where they unfortunately contact their landlord without doing the proper due diligence in preparing for the negotiation. Would it matter to know that other tenants in your building are paying more rent than you? Or perhaps you're in a situation where the landlord had the interest of selling the property. What are the ways you can figure out that information? And that all plays into how you negotiate the lease agreement. Only after doing proper due diligence should you contact your landlord and begin negotiating the rental rates. And you may ask, well, why do we negotiate the rent first and not the legal terms? The reason why we prefer to negotiate the rental rates is because we know that's what landlords want. Every landlord wants to maximize the value of the property, and the way they do that is by ensuring that they're getting the right amount of rent for the space you're occupying. Now, once the rental rate negotiations is out of the way, it's a lot easier to discuss the legal provisions, because everything else in the lease agreement that matters to you, to the landlord, is an exercise of risk management. And there's going to be certain things they'll agree to and other concessions that they may not want to give you but are open to discussing if there's some give and take. And if you're a doctor who is 64 years old and is looking at putting up the for sale sign in front of the practice, then does it matter if your rental rate is below market or at market? Would it matter a lot if you had to pay 50 cents per square foot more or $1 per square foot more to make sure that the landlord relieves you of liability after you sign a lease, or to give you the peace of mind that if something happened to you, you would have the ability to terminate the lease agreement? In some cases, it does make sense to pay for the value you get by having the legal protections. In other cases, if your rent is above market and you simply cannot sustain the hospital with the current expenses that you have, there has to be a conversation with the landlord. But don't leave that conversation 6 months prior to the expiration of your lease agreement. Timing is everything. After we negotiate the rental rates and the legal terms with the landlord, we then finalize the lease, and only then do we finalize the lease agreement. And when we finalize the lease agreement, we have to make sure that all the wins we obtained throughout the negotiation process, which may take 4 weeks or it could take 2 years, that all those are captured in that final document and nothing is left out. Too many of you signing lease agreements today after negotiations do not review the lease from cover to cover. And you may be surprised to find out that the landlord who removed the onerous liability within one section of the lease agreement may have reinserted that same provision elsewhere in the document. Just to summarize, the key takeaways from today's webinar: the details in your lease agreement can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars if left alone. It's not simply about rental rates. Most of you that have registered for the webinar today probably did so under the impression that to you, your objective was to get the most affordable rental rate. And I think that rent is absolutely important. But don't forget that it's really also about, when you're negotiating a lease agreement, about maximizing the flexibility you have to grow the clinic, in addition to minimizing your risk and liability and achieving long-term peace of mind. And you want to be strategic with negotiations, right? After the webinar, do not send your landlord a laundry list of items that you like in the lease agreement. Be strategic, because you have to understand what the landlord's priorities are before you start negotiations. And you don't get what you deserve, you do get what you negotiate into your lease agreement. Some of you may have been discouraged because you have contacted your landlord, and the landlord 24 months prior to the expiration of your lease agreement said, I am not interested in negotiating right now, I have too many things on the agenda, or I'll get back to you in 2 weeks' time when I get back from vacation, and you give up. And the reality is that landlords know that when they get you close to the expiration date, they themselves provide them with the opportunity to get the better end of the deal. But you have to be persistent, and persistence requires, in many cases, working with the right team to get you the terms that you need. And you want to start the process early. Again, if there's one thing that you should take away from today's webinar, is be proactive. I've had doctors that have attended my seminar in person, and they have let their lease agreement lapse, and they contact me where before they had 2.5 years of term left. A lot of the concessions we were able to get previously because simply time isn't on our side. So now I'd like to take the opportunity to take some questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to the chat dialog window. And so if you have any questions, please realize that this presentation does not allow you to call in with your questions, but we will be able to take your questions through this chat window, which is located on the top right-hand corner of your screen is where you should see that. And I think that one of the attendees here has a question, and I'll wait for that. And in the meantime, I also wanted to take a poll of the audience here with regards to what motivated you to register for this webinar. And please take some time now to either type in your questions, or alternatively, or at the same time, you can also take the poll, because I'm very curious to know if we've been able to meet your learning objectives. I also wanted to mention that if you take a look at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there are some links to online resources, and we have some fantastic resources available to you should you wish to learn more about rental rates, or perhaps the process for assigning your veterinary office lease agreement when you're looking at selling the business, and how do you create, for example, a stand-firm lease agreement if you're the owner of the building, should you have a lease agreement. So those are fantastic resources that we've taken a lot of time to develop and are happy to share with you. So far it looks like 26% of the attendees of today's webinar attended the webinar because their lease agreement is up for renewal. Another 30% came to the webinar for other reasons, but 20% are looking at either retiring or transitioning, and it also looks like about 13% of our attendees are starting or opening a new practice, which is pretty exciting given the fact that we love working with ambitious doctors seeking to start their dream. So we have some questions here. Andrea asks, we are 24 months away. Do you handle 100% of negotiation? The answer is yes. Part of our firm, aside from running educational webinars, is engaged proactively in assisting doctors that are overwhelmed with respect to how to negotiate our lease agreement. It is something that we handle directly for our clients, and that also includes all the negotiations on the rental rates, in addition to negotiating the legal provisions so that you don't have to hire a lawyer additionally to address those complicated legal provisions. And I also have a question from Jeff, who says, my current rental rate is $15 triple net, so he's paying $15 on a lease agreement where he's also paying for the operating expenses and taxes and insurance. And across the street is an $11 unit. It's not an uncommon question. In fact, very many doctors ask this question all the time, and it's 80% occupied, but mine is less than 50%. So what are your thoughts on the move? So essentially, what he's asking us, which is a fantastic question, is there's a space available across the street. The rent is lower. My building is half empty. Do I move? The answer is it depends. You have to factor in the costs of moving. Is the landlord across the street who's offering that unit for $4 less per square foot than what Jeff is paying, are they willing to contribute towards the cost of the relocation or the build-out? If yes, it may be a very attractive opportunity. I take the approach of negotiating both with the prospective landlord and your current landlord simultaneously to determine the most feasible long-term solution. Christy asks us, what do you charge to negotiate or renew a lease agreement? Christy, lease reviewed, and I'll put up a slide that has my contact information, so you have the ability to contact me if you'd like more information on our services. And we have another question here. What's the most important clause in the lease for a veterinary practice? I would say, again, it depends on where you are within your career, but in our experience, most doctors that are starting practices do not pay enough attention to how those rental rates could fluctuate year over year. And for doctors who are mid-career, the option to renew is a provision that is not really addressed. They just assume if I contact the landlord, they'll be fair or there'll be a reasonable process for negotiating a lease. And certainly for veterinary practices that are looking at going through a transition and doctors looking to sell, assignment. The right to assign the lease agreement is absolutely critical. Marinder asks us, we already signed a lease agreement for 10 years, 3 years ago, so there's 7 years of term left. What is the readiness for us to look at it? We essentially review lease agreements despite when they expire. We don't only review lease agreements that have an expiry of within 24 months. So if anybody is attending today's webinar and you sign a lease agreement with more than 24 months of term on it, by all means contact us and we'll review the lease for you, and we'll basically advise you on the timeline for negotiating the lease, and we'll track the critical dates of your lease agreement so that you don't miss those opportunities. We have a question from Lindsay. My landlord said I have to move offices. Can they really relocate my practice? Wow. Every time I hear this question, and I hear it every day because I work in the industry, I'm just shocked by the number of tenants that do not know whether or not their landlord has a right to relocate. And I don't, blame our clients, because the reality is this is not something you were trained in. So to answer your question, Christy, we have to look at the lease agreement and determine, sorry, this is Lindsay who's asking the question, not Christy, and determine whether or not this relocation clause or right exists in the lease agreement. If the relocation clause is in the lease, then the landlord can legally relocate your clinic, and you have to move offices. And the only question there is how much are they going to pay for, and will there be any significant downtime? I'm a bit overwhelmed with the questions we have, but I landlord finance the build-out versus myself? Christy, thank you for the question. I advised a doctor on Monday of this week on that exact topic. He's been able to get approval for financing for $600,000, and he does have the option of asking the landlord to finance the build-out. And what we did is we basically first negotiated rental rates to get them as low as possible, and then and only then discuss the notion of negotiating tenant improvement allowance and requesting that from the landlord, because we can identify what the delta is, right? If the landlord is adding $6 a square foot to the base rental rate we initially negotiated, we know that it's going to be probably more cost effective for the doctor to finance a build out himself. So that really depends on how much the landlord is willing to contribute and what is the rental rate, because most landlords are going to factor that into the rental rate if they're giving you a build-out allowance. I also want to emphasize, by the way, that Cirrus Consulting Group, our team, is a resource that's available to all of you through Henry Schein Animal Health. So if you are a Henry Schein Animal Health customer, either contact your Henry Schein consultant, your representative, or alternatively get in touch with us, because there's a lot of things that we can do to make sure your rights as a tenant are protected. Jeremy asks a question. I'm the youngest of 4 owners in the practice. And by the way, Jeremy, thank you for taking the time to join the webinar today. And he's asking that the fact that he built out the practice from the ground up 3 years ago, all 4 partners are owners in the professional corporation, it looks like, and I did not have the financing to buy into the land and building, so the other 3 partners from the LLC, is there a standard formula based on gross income then rent is calculated from? So Jeremy, I'm going to take this question offline only because I need to ask you some further information before I can provide you with an answer. But if you're in a situation, and anybody today who's attending the webinar, in a situation where you are in a partnership agreement and there's co-ownership of the building, that can be fairly complicated, and we'll really need to look that you're in. So I'm just going to end this poll. So it looks like the majority of today's webinar attendees have attended because they are renewing a lease agreement. So this really does make sense. Andrea, thank you for attending. I just noticed that you thanked us for delivering this webinar. And I also want to thank Henry Schein for the opportunity to educate a lot of practices on this very important topic. The webinar, as I mentioned earlier, has been recorded, and sometime over the next few business days, each of you should be getting an email from Henry Schein Animal Health with a copy or a link to this webinar recording. I want to just let you know that aside from the resources we have at our disposal, we are offering the first 5 attendees who reach out to us via phone or email, and my phone number and my email address are on the screen, a complimentary 30-point lease inspection for no charge. So if you are one of those doctors who is in a lease agreement today and is worried about the terms in your lease agreement, you may want to just reach out to us, and hopefully you're one of the first 5 attendees. For anybody else who has questions, we will certainly take your questions. There's no doubt about that. But this 30-point lease inspection that's valued at $1,500 will be given away to the first 5 attendees who contact us. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for their time. And regardless of what your objectives are, I do wish you a tremendous success in the journey of running the practice as efficiently as possible and really getting ahead of your lease negotiation.